I think the starting point has to be, in order to understand Islam and the origins of Islam, I would have to take you back to the late 6th century, early 7th century AD. I use the Christian dating system because it's near universal this time, not because I myself am a Christian. But it's in that period, something began to happen in the Arabian Peninsula with the creation of religion. And like all the other great religions, world religions, it was created at a particular point, a particular society in crisis, at which someone emerged with a vision which they believed was ordained by God of how people should alter their behaviour and society should be reorganised in order to deal with the deep crisis. If you look at the other world religions or religious systems, for instance, the rise of Buddhism in North India, it rose precisely at such a period of crisis. If you look at the rise of the various religious systems, Confucianism and Shintoism and so forth in China, it rise again in the 5th, 6th century BC, it rose precisely in such a period of deep crisis. If you look at the rise of Christianity, it rose a deep crisis in one part of the Roman Empire, Palestine, and then spread throughout the Roman Empire as a whole. As the empire as a whole, it entered in a crisis in which people began to find their lives in one way or another unbearable, and looked for a religious vision of how to deal with it. Islam grew up, originated, first budding was in 6th century, late 6th century, early 7th century Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula at the time was going through two sorts of crises. One was an internal crisis. This is an area which historically have been inhabited by pastoral tribes. Pastoralists are people who are nomads who move from place to place with herds of animals, in the case of the Arabian Peninsula, herds of camels and so forth, and populations that lived on them. Pastoral nomads historically generally tend to have a sort of religious identification with one sort of being which is said to represent the particular group which is moving from place to place, which represents its identity. And because you have rival groups, you have rival deities that of one sort or another represent their identity. In the case of the Arabian Peninsula, in the previous 1,000 years, some of those pastoralists had begun to settle down, to develop agriculture, begin to lead different sorts of lives, begin to look towards different notions of religion, sometimes bringing with them their old religious deities, and therefore in the towns you had rival religious deities. In the towns which began to develop in the oases and in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, fertile area, in what is now Yemen, various different religious deities. Others began to identify with other religions that existed around, which had developed earlier, which corresponded much more to settled life than to nomadic life. To Judaism, to the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, to a religion which was quite widespread at the time called Manichaeism, and to three rival forms of Christianity. When I say three rival forms, I don't just mean three groups which peacefully coexisted, but people who fought viciously with each other over their interpretation of what Christianity could be. The Arabian Peninsula had an additional feature. Often pastoralists, not merely live of their herds, because they've been adept at moving long distances, become traders between the great centres of civilization. And this was certainly true with the Arabian Peninsula. If I'd had my visual aid here, I'd be able to show you the trade maps connecting the Roman Empire, based upon Italy and Egypt and so forth, through the Arabian Peninsula with India, and from India to China. You'd see the other route which goes just north from what is now Palestine, across Syria, the Fertile Crescent, to the north of India, and again across the Silk Route to China. The Arabian Peninsula was at the centre of trade routes, and therefore you had people from a tribal background, some of whom becoming quite wealthy as they took part in trade, others settling, each having different religious conceptions. So in each town there would be fights and struggles between people with different religious conceptions. Also, once they began to settle, the old tribal way of maintaining peace between people began to break down. Peace was maintained between the tribes on the basis that if you kill a member of our tribe, we'll kill a member of yours, and that creates a situation in which, as there's mutual deterrence, a sort of primitive form of MAD, in which you don't kill someone from another tribe because you'll end up with a long vendetta. Once you settle in the towns, this can lead to complete breakdowns of law and order, make it very, very difficult for some of the traders to continue, encourage brigandry, banditry, and so forth, as well as trade. That was the internal crisis. And the internal crisis itself meant that people's old conceptions of how to live no longer fitted. It created a stage of what later Muslims refer to as a state of barbarity. They use the Arabic term which means barbarity. Life became intolerable for some people. But this took place in sense of a much more important crisis, in some ways, a crisis in the societies around the Arabian Peninsula. Because the Arabian Peninsula is the meeting point of two great empires. One empire, I think most people in the room who have European education will have some, or European upbringing, will have some understanding about, which is the Roman Empire, which much of the West European part of the Roman Empire had disintegrated 2 centuries before, but the eastern part of the Roman Empire had actually in 550 extended across North Africa, Egypt, and Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, up to Constantinople and into the Balkans. Much of the Mediterranean was controlled by the old Roman Empire. The other great empire was the Abbasid Empire, the Persian Empire, which ran all the way from the borders of Syria through Iraq into right across to the borders of what is today Afghanistan. Two great empires, both going into various forms of crises, both involved in the years from about 580 onwards in a series of wars with each other, devastating wars, so that the Roman Empire lost control of Egypt to the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire then lost control back to the Roman Empire, a state of, if you like, a state of chaos, of crisis, a crisis which impacted upon the Arabian Peninsula, in which some groups, some tribes were allied with one empire, some with another, influences of both empires at the South of the Arabian Peninsula, the whole of that area involved in this crisis. Against this background, a young Arab born in one of the big trading cities, Mecca, Muhammad, was brought up. He came from a trading family, but he was an orphan. Initially, he himself was quite poor. He is quite poor until he was in, I think, his 20s. When then he was lucky enough to find a widow, Khadijah, who herself was a merchant, and he married her, and together they began to develop a fairly successful merchant enterprise. According to one of the stories in this period, Muhammad, as a merchant, went from Mecca up the Arabian Peninsula as far as Palestine and back again, involved in trade. In the process, he came across the various different religions which had settled. The three rival forms of Christianity, all at war with each other. It should be said, persecuting each other viciously, and also persecuting the Jews, the Zoroastrians, the Manichaeans, and so on and so forth. And he got back to Mecca, and he became more and more acutely aware himself of the crisis inside Meccan society. It's often in situations people undergo a feeling that they themselves, in their own internal psyche, all the crisis of society are reflected. And he began to develop, he believed he had a vision, he believed God spoke to him, and in order to understand what follows, you don't really, whether you believe in God or not doesn't make much difference in terms of the analysis. So you'll find serious Muslim accounts of this by one of the professors at Cambridge University, a man called Akbar, or you'll find serious atheistic accounts, Marxist accounts of this, for instance, by Maxine Rodenson, really provide a similar account of what happened. He had these visions, and in a series of visions which took place beginning in the year about 610, going right through to Muhammad's death in 632, a series of visions which God spoke to him and told him really a scheme, an ideal of how society should be organised, but not only how it should be organised, how values should be changed from the old values, but also in that scheme how to implement practically the scheme in the Arabian Peninsula. In some ways, in this sense, it was very, very similar, if you like, to the ideas which Christ had when he went into the wilderness and believed that God spoke to him about how society how people should act towards each other. But in Muhammad's case, it was not merely a series of general ideas about how people should behave towards each other, but also a scheme for how he began to implement this. He drew around himself a group of disciples in Mecca, initially a quite small group, a dozen people, then eventually perhaps 200 people, but each of them consciously broke with their old tribal identities. They preached a notion of a society in which the old tribal warfare broke down, in which there was justice applied to all people equally, in which the old clashes between the rich and the poor should be softened. The increasing class division in society should be softened by the rich caring for the poor, although the poor also expected to show loyalty towards the rich, in which women were provided with a certain standing vis-à-vis their husbands. The husbands were no longer just allowed to treat their women as chattels. They had to treat their women with respect. At the same time, the women were due to show deference towards their husbands. This is a new image of society. Society which aimed to draw together people faced with this deep social crisis to show a way forward. It should be said about this image of society, like any religious image in such a society, in a class society which preaches reconciliation and community between people, it was always subject to two interpretations. One interpretation was it was about just bringing people together, loving each other, doing away with the great grave social differences, the antagonisms between people. Another interpretation was it could be seen as we have existing society, it has a few faults, minor reform can change it. But nevertheless, it was this vision which he began to preach. This vision in about the year 620, this vision was to antagonize all the other groups in Mecca, the old merchant groups, the old tribal groups, who were upset by this notion of reconstituted society. Muhammad and his friends were forced to leave Mecca and went to the city some distance further north, the city of Medina, where they found, again, a society in crisis. But in that society, most of the different groups in Medina were prepared to embrace what Muhammad preached. They began to establish that system in Medina. In the process, it led to conflict with some groups. He tried to attack them. Battles took place, and Muhammad succeeded in Medina, establishing not just a small society of people dedicated to a better world, but in a sense, establishing a military revolutionary project for uniting Medina behind him and subduing those people in Medina who didn't accept this new vision of how society should be operated. The vision was so successful that Muhammad was able to create various alliances with the various pastoral tribes and merchant groups in the Arabian Peninsula. So by the year 630, something like the 10 years after the movement from Mecca to Medina, it's a very important thing for all Muslims. It's called the Hijrah. That's about 620. 10 years after Hijrah, in 630, Muhammad was able to return to Mecca, and by his death in 632, had established hegemony for his form of organisation across the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. This vast area accepting the new religion. Muhammad died in 632, but the general crisis in the world around the Arabian Peninsula hadn't disappeared. And his successors, the people who had worked with him in this small Islamic group initially, between 610 and 620, were now able to lead the various Arabic tribes out of the Arabian Peninsula under an astonishing series of conquests in the next 30 or 40 years, which brought under their control all of North Africa, all of Palestine, all of Syria, all of what is now Iraq, and most of what is now Iran. A huge series of conquests. A conquest which reached the stage, beginning of the 8th century, the conquest of Spain, moving right up into reaching the high point in southern France. You can understand these conquests. There's two interpretations of them. I think the two interpretations have to be seen as, in some ways, complementary. One is just the power of the Arab tribes, once united behind a single religious vision, overcome the old antagonisms between them. The ability of particularly the camel cavalry to move through the desert and strike at distant towns, emerging from nowhere to take towns and cities and so forth, militarily. But I think the other element is very, very important. In terms of the crisis of these old societies, people everywhere wanted some alternative to what was presented to them previously. It's interesting, the rival religious groups, many of the rival Christian groups, embraced the victories of the Arab armies because the Arab armies no longer oppressed them for their religious reasons. If you were a Nestorian Christian in the Catholic world, you were oppressed. If you were a Syriac Christian in the Catholic world, you were oppressed. Once the Islamic armies took over, you were no longer oppressed. Very, very important in terms of current discussions. In the cities, in cities like Damascus or the cities of southern Spain, when the Arab armies appeared, the Jewish population were overjoyed because it meant the end of the oppression at the hands of the Christians. So you had the spread of this empire. The spread of this empire with this message. This is the new society. This is going to overcome the problem. The difficulty, however, with the spread of the empire began to emerge contradictions within Islam, which has continued to pervade today. The central contradiction was this. The religion was one of reconciliation in order to overcome the squabbling, the fighting, the murder in the society which existed prior to the emergence of Muhammad. But the reconciliation could always be interpreted in two ways. It could be interpreted as reconciliation means just the rich giving charity to the poor, so there's an Islamic charity called the zakat, which I think was 2.5% of your wealth was meant to be given each year to the poor, and that was meant to mean the rich were caring for the poor, and in return the poor were meant to be obedient towards the rich. The man was told, you mustn't beat the woman. I should say this because you read disgusting stuff. I mean, the man called Landis has written a history of the rise of the Industrial Revolution and says Islam allows man to beat the wife at any occasion. It's complete absolute rubbish. In the Quran it says absolutely clearly the man is not allowed to beat the wife. The man has to care for the wife. The man has to show much more care for the wife than in Christianity. According to Christianity, most Christian doctrine, the woman is meant to not enjoy sex whatsoever. There's no doubt you read in Muslim doctrines the man's duty is to provide sexual enjoyment to the woman. It's very, very different interpretation. But at the same time, the woman in return is meant to show obedience to her husband, to accept his over. He's the active person in the relationship. She's meant to be more passive, and so on and so forth. That's one interpretation. But the other interpretation is that Islam reconciliation means we're down with all the old oppression. We have to hammer against oppression. We have to rise up and fight oppression in the same way that Muhammad rose up and fought the old ruling families inside Islam. As the Islamic Empire grew, this contradiction became deeper and deeper because the leaders of the Islamic armies took over old societies and adopted many of the ways of the old society. The leaders, the caliphs, it should be clear, there's something else needs to be clear here. The caliphs were the political leaders. They were never the religious leaders of Islam. The caliphs, the political leaders of the Islamic empires, as they took over the old societies, more and more adopted the behaviours of the emperors who had ruled over these societies previously. And therefore, within 30 years of Muhammad's death, 25 years of Muhammad's death, you had deep tensions emerging between people who thought they'd lost out, Arabs who thought they'd lost out in the emergence of the new empire, and those who had gained from it. First big battle took place, a battle which took place supposedly who's going to succeed, who's going to become the political leader of the empire. But in reality, a battle between those who felt they'd lost out and those who had gained through it. The first civil war, a civil war between rival Muslim armies. I told you some calculations, 10,000 deaths in that battle. First civil war which took place. Followed, again, if I had the visual thing, I have the dates here and everything happened. Followed by another civil war. Arguments. And in these civil wars, three trends began to emerge within Islam. One was the trend, which is the trend identified with the caliphs, who became eventually the mainstream of Sunni Islam. A second stream developed, identified with one of Muhammad's disciples, Ali, his cousin who married one of his daughters, his son-in-law, who, am I right? Yes, his son-in-law, who claimed that he should be the genuine thing. And Ali said the existing caliphs were oppressive and so on and so forth. Ali, in order to get a succession of the empire, did an agreement, however, with one of the people in the old caliph groups, but in return, some of Ali's supporters then rebelled against him, a third stream, the Qadridates, who really had this line, hostile commentators referred to as anarchists, people who objected completely with the new order of an empire, of a regime, of a ruling class, and so forth. These streams continued. So involved in the ideology of Islam was these different ways of interpreting it: a religion of reconciliation, or reconciliation of fighting against oppression. And it should be said, all through the history of Islam since, these things have continually recurred. Whenever people have read the Quran or read the accounts of the Prophet's life, these two interpretations have emerged. It's not true, as Tony Blair says, there's a thing called moderate Islam, a thing called extreme Islam, and you have to choose one or the other. Both interpretations exist within it. But to jump through a bit of history, the first empire lasted about 100 years, but a series of revolts against it erupted in a revolution about 120 years after the Prophet's death. The first empire is usually called the Umayyad Empire. Around the middle of the 8th century, around 750, a revolutionary movement developed, led by sounds like a classic revolutionary, a man who did conspiratorial work in different parts of the eastern part of the empire, working underground, drawing together the various revolutionary groups. Great uprising took place, which swept from the eastern part of the empire, that is from eastern Iran, through to Iraq and then to Syria, and established a new ruling order. The establishment of what was called the Abbasid Empire. And it should be said, in terms of history, it's quite an important difference. The Umayyad Empire, the first empire, was very much an empire of Arabs ruling over non-Arabs. The second empire incorporated the non-Arabs into Islam and created very much the modern Islamic Orthodoxy as we know today. The Abbasid Empire was an empire which, in terms of its accomplishments, when I'm talking about people talk about the achievements of Islamic civilization, you're really talking about the Abbasid Empire, because it's one of those periods in history in which a combination of a new ideology and a new organisation of society unleashes the capacity of people to create more wealth, more advance, and so on and so forth. The new ideology breaking down the sectarian splits between the rival forms of Christianity and Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism and Judaism and so forth. Religious tolerance, on the one hand, allowed different groups to prosper. On the reorganisation, on the other hand, the unification of this huge area. If you look at a map, which again, one of my visual aids was a map to show this degree of unification, all the way virtually from the Straits of Gibraltar, all the way through to the area to Afghanistan, and the area north of Afghanistan, an area called Transoxania, which was one of the most prosperous and productive areas of the world at that time. This empire united all this area. In uniting it, it unleashed the capacity of agriculture to develop, for instance. There's a myth, I'm sorry, propagated by some articles that appeared in Socialist Review and International Socialism, that this is a period in which there was no advance in terms of agriculture. What was actually incredible advance, because what actually took place, all sorts of crops which existed, tropical crops that existed in India and Africa, the new civilization, the new unleashing of people's energies, meant people learnt to propagate these crops in new areas. Crops like, I've got a list here somewhere if anyone wants to hear it, of millet, cotton, hard rice, sorghum, hard wheat, sorghum, sugarcane, rice, watermelon, eggplant, spinach, artichokes, sour oranges, all of which meant that the agriculture of the Mediterranean area, which had previously been winter agriculture, had been too hot to grow other crops in summer, began to grow. Repairing in old areas where there are important massive irrigation structures, like the Mesopotamia, Iraq, the repairing of the irrigation structures, the building of new irrigation structures, development of new techniques for lifting water out the Nile in Egypt. Fantastic advance in agriculture taking place. On the back of the advance in agriculture, advance in crafts. The introduction of paper making to the Far East, advances in ceramics, pottery making, and so on and so forth. On top of that, fantastic advances in knowledge and understanding. Again, it's something which is often hid from people. That when people talk about a Judaic Christian tradition, somehow going straight from the ancient world to modern Europe, or a Greco-Romano tradition going from the past to the modern world. In reality, if you actually look at the process, firstly, there's not just a Greco-Romano tradition or a Judaic-Christian tradition. There's I don't know if you want to call it a Buddhist, Hindu tradition from India. There's a Confucian, Buddhist, Confucian, Shinto tradition from China, all of which fed through in order to carry through the advance of Europe. But also, the Greco-Romano part, of course, what the Muslim Empire took over was a huge chunk of what had been the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was not just something confined to wet, cold, damp parts of North to West Europe. It was the whole of North Africa, and the jewel in the crown of the Roman Empire was Egypt, which became part of the Islamic Empire. And therefore you talked about the traditions of Greek philosophy, which developed in Athens, then transported to Alexandria, then become part of the traditions of the Abbasid Empire, and synthesizes the traditions from India and from China and so forth to produce a fantastic advance in human knowledge. You go through, if you talk in terms of astronomy and astrology, very much fused at the time. I don't go into the arguments. Astrology didn't always seem as absurd as it seems today. The idea of some order in the universe which is everywhere, the idea that you can understand this order, it's not a completely absurd idea. But in order to understand, you had advances in astronomy, you had the first count of how the around Earth, what the size of it was, calculations of the size of the Earth, new developments for looking at the stars, astrolabes for guiding ships at the sea. You had developments in terms of botany, understanding plants, necessary if you were going to take part in this agricultural revolution, new advances in terms of physiology, understanding the human body, new advances in medicine, and so on and so forth. All this fused together, advances in mathematics. You know, our numbering system, 1, 2, 3, 4, the digits as we see them, are actually a product of India transplanted to the Arab world, introduced to Western Europe. The importance of the concept of the zero, discovered in India, absolutely necessary for any form of mathematics beyond the most basic of mathematics, adopted and taken up during the period of the Abbasid Empire. It was also a period of literature, of writing, of a very, very free expression. If you read editions of 101 Nights, they were written at the height of the Abbasid Empire, about, I'm trying to remember the year, 1780, 1790, that sort of period. Written and expressed as a society of merchants, of people articulate, of people discuss, who have some understanding of the world, gives notions of a vast geographical spread of the voyages. I mean, the voyages of Sinbad, which most of us are brought up on watching silly films when we're children, expressed a society in which people had been to China, had probably been to the Atlantic Ocean, had been all around down probably to the south of India and so forth. That's what it gave expression to. Now this society, it should be said, is a key link in the development of modern European understanding. It's a key link in the sense that if you want to understand where the European Renaissance came from, you can't understand it without understanding what happened in the 11th, 9th, 10th, 11th century Islamic world, and how that crossed at a crucial point in time into the European world. Europe, of course, during this period was going through what's normally called the Dark Ages. There's some discussion sometimes about how dark the Dark Ages were, but they were fairly miserable in terms of decline of the towns, decline of literacy. You know, according to some accounts, literacy in Europe was confined to a few monasteries on the west of Ireland at one point in time. Maybe this is exaggeration. This sense, there was in Europe, from the 10th, 11th century onwards, a revival of agriculture, a revival of urban life, and people then in Europe began searching up for ideas. There's only one place they could get the ideas from, and the place they had to get the ideas from was the Islamic Empire. And therefore you find that the first flowering of the pre-Renaissance, I call it the pre-Renaissance in Europe, because people tend to think that Dante was somebody who wrote in the 15th century. He actually wrote in the 13th and 14th century, if I got my dates right. Dante, the first, what later called scholastic philosophy in its initial stage, not particularly scholastic. They looked for their ideas. The people looking for ideas, if you're in Paris or in northern Italy, or for that matter in Oxford, the only place you could get the ideas was from the Islamic world, from Islamic Sicily or from Islamic Spain. And it was something actually which at the time was recognised by people. The Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, sometimes referred to as a great Catholic theologian. I'm sorry, I'm an atheist, but I don't really believe in great theologians. Was actually very much influenced by philosophers in the Islamic world. If you read Chaucer, there's an amazing passage in Chaucer which I came across on a website. I don't want to pretend I've just read the whole of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. But it refers, I think it's from the Pardoner's Tale. It refers to, some doctor in the Canterbury Tales. Well he knew the old Aesculapius, and Deus Cordis and Ec Rufus, and Ippocras Hali and Gallian, Serapion, Russes, and Apisain. He's talking about the great medical figures. Now you then find out Serapion was in fact Ibn Tarabicunan, a Syriac Arab physician of the 9th century. Russes was an Arab clinician of the 10th century, and Avicenna, normally known as Avicenna in Europe, was one of the great Muslim philosophers. You actually talk about continuity in terms of thought. You have to understand that one of the strange things about Columbus, when Columbus set sail, he knew the earth was round. This myth that you thought the earth was flat is nonsense. But the reason why he thought he'd reach China quickly, his calculation of the size of the world was a calculation done by an Arab Muslim mathematician in the 10th century who had made a mistake in his calculations. And therefore, in Renaissance Italy and Spain, the level of mathematics hadn't yet reached the stage it had in 9th and 10th century Islamic world. And this is what was achieved in this period. Something else also has to be said about this period. This is also the period in which Muslim orthodoxy, as it's known today, exists. You see, and here is a challenge often to many Muslims who don't fully understand this, because the Muslim orthodoxy was not something written down by the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 1632, and then carried uncorrupted into the distant future. In reality, there were different versions of the Quran existed. In 100 years of the Islamic conquests, different versions of the Quran began to exist in different parts of the Arab world. You had a problem. The Quran, supposedly, there's different arguments like this, but the orthodox was that Muhammad didn't know how to read and write, and dictated it. Now, it should be said that, for instance, other people like Rawlinson, it's absurd to claim that Muhammad didn't know how to read and write, and he believed Muhammad actually wrote down bits on scraps of, not paper, scraps of parchment and so on and so forth, and these were collated together. But anyway, there were different versions of the Quran. More importantly, perhaps, there were different interpretations of what the Arabic meant in the Quran, because Arabic was not generally a written language at the time when Muhammad wrote. Therefore, you could have long discussions about whether a particular word meant this, that, or the other. How did you understand the text of the Quran? That led to enormous discussions. Once you had the establishment of the Abbasid Empire, this development of culture, of science, of understanding, there were discussions among Islamic scholars about what is the correct text of the Quran, how is the text of the Quran to be understood. A further thing went with that. Alongside the Quran for every devout Muslim are the hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet. The difficulty was, in the 100 years after Muhammad's death, you imagine it, you had a great leader 100 years ago, lots and lots of people knew him, they all come out with different stories. Anyone who's done any oral history of any sort whatsoever, what really did Lloyd George say to Winston Churchill at some party in 1925? You'll get 200 different versions. That's so that even though there were newspaper reports and literary reports, people wrote down and so forth immediately afterwards what was said. If you imagine this is carried by word of mouth over 100 years before somebody gets written down and so forth, very, very vast numbers of different versions of hadiths. What took place in the Abbasid Empire was to try to develop a list of what the correct interpretation of the Quran was, what the correct hadiths were, what the correct sunnah, the actions of the Prophet were, all to be drawn together in orthodoxy. But this produced itself enormous controversy inside Islam, and it's produced controversies ever since, because if you had the radical version of Islam, Islam is a religion of fighting against oppression, then you say, actually, the period by which time the Hadiths and the Quran were got together was a period of degeneration of Islam. This is not my view. For instance, Khomeini, the ruler of Iran after the revolution, was absolutely adamant that everything after the second caliph, I think the second caliph, was corrupt in terms of everything after the time of Ali was corrupt in terms of Islam, and probably the second and the third caliph were corrupt. You had, if you had this radical version of Islam, you say we want to go back to the original Islam, but you have a problem because the text of the Quran, the Hadiths, and so on and so forth, are drawn up during the period of corruption. This creates all sorts of controversies and arguments and so forth. You have, in this process, other enormous debates took place. A group emerged, called the Matazites, who basically argued, we're Muslims, we're absolutely good Muslims, but we understand, we praise Allah, because Allah is the embodiment of everything good. If the embodiment of everything good, Allah must behave rationally. He can't behave irrationally. Therefore, if we are to understand the religion, we understand the Quran, the Hadiths, and the Sunnah, we have to understand that if there are contradictions in them which go against reason, that means the text has become corrupted or we've not understood it in the right way. Other people emerged, more conservative people, who said, no, we have to go by the very, very word of the Quran. If the Quran contradicts itself, this shows that God has much better brain than us because he understands these contradictions in a way in which we can't. I mean, similar arguments always have taken place in Christianity. These arguments took place. And they weren't settled once and for all. They took place overall over a 200 or 300 year period of the existence of the Abbasid Empire. And therefore you find right through it a series of religious controversies. And I would argue, if you look at one side in those controversies, it's actually the beginnings of what Europeans would call enlightenment. It's the beginnings of the idea the world is rational. Rational knowledge is possible of it. And this goes right through to the 11th and 12th century. The first great thinker in this terms is a man, Ibn Rushd, normally known as Averroes, who argues absolutely clearly Islam is a rational religion. We have to understand the Quran as a rational text. In the Quran itself, it says if you can't understand some passages in this text, you have to use analogy to understand it. We have to have analogous reading the Quran and see it as a text, which is a rational text, unleashing rational knowledge. The other side of it, which became predominant, was the argument, the argument came forward by another theologian, which was really that that actually we have to abide by the absolute text of the Quran. Any analogous reasoning is wrong. In order to understand the text, the only people who are able to understand it are people who've gone through a long, long religious education to understand what the orthodoxy is. So within Orthodox Sunni Islam, this big debate took place. It was resolved, and I'll come back in my last few minutes to talk about how it was resolved. It was resolved in the 12th and 13th century by what was called the closing of the gates of Ijtihad. Ijtihad is the ability to interpret the Quran and the texts and so forth according to the reason. And really what was said is it became blasphemous to interpret it in terms of the forms of reason. Now, why did this take place and why did the advance of Islamic civilization come to an end? I should say here in passing, there's one crude argument I think is absolutely wrong, which is to do that somehow there was a different form of society in mode of production that existed in Europe, a mode of production which could not advance, sometimes called the Asiatic mode of production, or sometimes called rather confusingly the tributary mode of production. If you actually look at forms of land ownership, land organisation and so forth, during this period in the Islamic world, the form of land organisation was not based on the state owning land. It was based on private land ownership, based on rise of merchant class and so on and so forth. Really, to understand how it comes to an end, you have to understand that all the pre-capitalist civilizations, there's an element of cycle in them, which is they go through a period of expansion of the capacity of human beings to make a livelihood, what Marx called the expansion of force of production. But in that process, the ruling class, which initially gives a push forward to society, then gets control of it and stops further advance. It absorbs all the surplus, it absorbs the wealth of society, and society grinds to a halt. If you look in terms of the Abbasid Empire, you can see that process, this great boost forward, but then the growth of luxury production, the growth of exploiting class, the exploiting class, in order to maintain its power, has, for instance, to develop an army based upon Turkish slaves. The generals and Turkish slave armies have more and more power. The ruling class that oppresses the peasantry in order to get the wealth it wants. The oppression of the peasantry means the neglect of agriculture. Agricultural expansion grinds to a halt. The irrigation works in Mesopotamia fall apart. And so Iraq, amazingly, from the 11th, 12th century onwards, Iraq becomes a society which hadn't been an urbanized society, begins ruralizing. People begin to abandon agriculture for pastoralism and so on and so forth. And therefore you see the Abbasid Empire comes to decline just at the point at which it passed the development of science and knowledge on to other parts of the world. That's not the end of the Islamic world. I mean, if I had another 20 minutes, I could talk about the end. Does not end with the end of the Abbasid Empire. Again, there is this crude view that Islam was always a non-developing thing. If you actually look, the centre of Islam moves then to other places. It moves to eastern Iran and the area called Transoxania, the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, north of Afghanistan, which is important. Absurd article in the Guardian today by Preston, the columnist, saying Afghanistan has never known anything but barbarity, chaos and so on and so forth. Afghanistan was once Herat, was one of the great Islamic cities, one of the great centres of civilization, and certainly Bukhara and Samarkand were city-states where there continued to be development for many, many decades, centuries after the collapse of the centre of the Abbasid Empire. Egypt, under various forms of organisation and society, continued to develop for the next 200 or 300 years. Muslim Spain continued to went through various crises and so forth. But if you go to the Alhambra in Granada, you can see the glories of Muslim Spain in the 12th and 13th century, not just the 9th and 10th century. You also have to say that the influence of Islam as a religion then spreads out. It spreads out to the Indian subcontinent. In the process, itself undergoing a change, it's important, incorporating it into it, the worship of holy men who become saints. I've been pulled up on this before. The veneration of holy men who become saints, effectively amounts to worship of saints, incorporated into the Sufi cults, which proliferated across the Indian subcontinent. And again, in India, you see a civilization developing, first under the Delhi Sultanate, and then under the Mughal regime, which goes right through to the building of the Taj Mahal in 1650. The Taj Mahal is not an indication of a society that no development of force of production. All the most advanced techniques known across the Eurasian continent, Eurasia, the European and Asian continents, went into the building of the Taj Mahal in 650. So Islamic society has not come to an end. What you can say is you say the crisis of the Abbasid Empire, the crisis occurs about the 10th, 11th century, it means it no longer has that same push forward. It's no longer the most advanced section of the development of the world. But that shouldn't surprise us. I'll end on this by saying if you look wherever, you look at pre-capitalist societies, you look at their development, they undergo advances, then they come to a stop. People talk about the Renaissance in Italy. People forget that Italy was not the birth. Italy may have been embryos of capitalism in the 14th, 15th century. Italy was notorious for its feudalism by the 17th century. Italy was not the place where you broke through. The Renaissance took place, but the ruling class, the corrupt ruling groups and so forth, took control of North Italian society and prevented its development. But the Reformation was a great advance forward in Germany in 1510s and 1515, 1520, 1525, and then suddenly when the peasants rose up, Luther put a stop on the development of the Reformation in southern Germany. Southern Germany ground back and remained a backward area for the next 200 years. Each stage you see the development, you see old ruling classes holding it back. Islam was one of those forces given a great representative religion and ideology and a great boost forward at one stage in history. The rulers who emerged out of the Islamic empires began a strain on it further. Finally, to talk about Islam today, which will lead on to further discussions, Islam throughout that period, every time an empire emerged, the two interpretations reigned there. Is Islam a conservative ideology in which you just accept what the priests say, and what the preachers say, and the preachers work in cohorts with the rulers, or is Islam an ideology of liberation, of struggle, and so on and so forth? The same contradiction exists in Buddhism, the same contradiction exists in Christianity, the same contradiction, but it's a contradiction which exists inside Islam, which means Islam has always been open to multiple interpretations, in reality multiple religious practices and so on and so forth. It's not a more barbaric religion, certainly, than Christianity. The history of Islamic society is not a history of backwardness, of stagnation and so forth. It's part of the process of the advance of humanity. Yeah, I'll take up some of the questions. I should have said that two things. One, if I'd had my visual aids, they would have helped some of the questions. Particularly the scale of the Islamic empires. I tried to show visually how after the collapse of the Abbasid Empire, Islam continued to spread, and the civilization, the areas it didn't spread by conquest. It spread generally along trade routes. It represented merchants in some ways carrying what may be called a more advanced culture, a more advanced way of seeing things. And during the spread of Islam, for instance, into what is now Indonesia, took place in the 13th, 14th century without military conquest, just on the impact of, if you like, I don't know if we can use these terms, a more advanced civilization in terms of more backward. I'm not sure about terms of advanced and backward, but people will understand what I mean. And it's also, I think it's also very, very important to understand that I made the point that the Mughal Empire in India, was not some sort of backward stagnating thing. It itself showed fantastic dynamism. The conquest of the Mughals in India took place using the most advanced artillery and logistic methods of warfare known anywhere in the world at the time which it took place. It spread because it not merely called conquest, because in some ways it welded Indian society together and carried forward for a bit. Also entered into a crisis. And all pre-capitalist societies entered into crisis, and people may notice also that all capitalist societies entered into crisis. And it began to go into a crisis in the time of the late 1670s, 1680s, and so on and so forth. And that crisis could have been resolved in two ways. Three ways. It could be resolved by the collapse of society. It could have been resolved by a revolutionary journey carrying society forward, or it was in fact resolved by the conquest by a power which had managed to avoid crisis up to that point and conquered it and welted and looted it and pushed it backwards. And therefore, the only thing I was trying to say is, in a certain sense, the period which Islam was a society based on Islam with a real driving force in terms of the advance of innovation, technology, understanding, and so forth, that came to an end with the collapse of the Abbasid Empire. Developments continued. It's not true that the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century was more backward than Western Europe. I mean, they nearly took Vienna, for God's sake. People forget these things. They came that close. In the 16th century, also the 17th century, they were incapable of fighting outside Vienna. That is the picture you have to have. But what is important, I'll reiterate it, societies enter into crisis in which these crises are either resolved by a revolutionary reconstitution of society, or they stagnate. And that's the general message of Marx, and it applies, and it doesn't matter what religion they hold, what culture they hold, and so forth. This is the central factor. The question, Islam did not go through a reformation. Well, two things have to be said on this. I mean, Tarek's normally more knowledgeable of this. I have quite a great respect for him, and certainly what he says about Islam, his books on Islam are very, very good. But he shows ignorance of the Reformation. The Reformation itself was in some ways a dilution in Germany of the developments of the Renaissance in Italy. It was a dilution, a popularization, and so forth, which was possible partly because printing existed, which hadn't existed during the Abbasid Empire. But the question is, the Reformation then in Germany did not lead to great progress. It led to the establishment of a single German language. It didn't lead to much more. If you look, the Reformation then takes root in France. The Reformation in France is buried in blood on St. Bartholomew's Day. And the Reformation then has to take root in Holland and Britain. It's only in Holland and Britain you can say the Reformation becomes the ideology of a rising class which came to conquering society. History is a series of dead ends when the ruling classes and their superstructures prevent the further development of means of creating wealth, of science, and understanding, and so on and so forth. And those dead ends take place in Europe just much elsewhere. Secondly, it has to break the dead ends, you need revolution. Essentially, Islam in the first place was a form of reformation, a form of reorganisation of existing belief systems, Christian belief systems, Manichaeism, Zoroastrism, Judaism melded together in a new vision of the world, which certainly with the Abbasid revolution, it was a revolution. It was merchants leading an onslaught upon an old corrupt society and carrying through beginnings of change. And then it stagnates after a certain period. But in that process, all the things we identify with the Enlightenment, the rule of reason, understanding the world, developing, are there, and they have to fight against people who believe this word is written in a book, therefore we have to go by that, all the old superstitious ways. That's the way I'd put it. As I said, I put this forward as an atheist, but I think as an atheist you have to have some understanding of how religion is interpreted in different ways, and people who believe developing religion can be rational, or they can be completely irrational, and it's a factor of forces at work in society. And since then in Islam, there have many attempts for people in Islamic societies to reconstitute society, to change society, to challenge it. Akbar, the ruler of India in the 1530s, 1540s, attempted to carry through a change from above Indian society, more rational and so forth. He failed, but the attempt was made. And we have to stand the attempt. I finally would say, when people talk about the Enlightenment in the West, and this really annoys me, the Enlightenment in the West didn't win at the end of the day through a victory of reason. It ran through the capacity of the sans-culottes in Paris to fight, to seize control of Paris, and to defeat the reactionary armies across Europe in the Battle of Valmy. That was the victory of the Enlightenment. And until then, enlightened ideas were very much enlightened to a small minority who didn't want the rest of society to develop. This is reality. It's unfortunate that the great Islamic thinkers never were capable, were not in a situation where they could movement develop that sort of capacity they could influence and give guidance to. This is the reality. That's how history operates. Sorry, a couple more things. I mean, lots more I should have said when I spoke. What I would say is, you get today as a sort of mirror image. You get these people who want to give this reactionary interpretation of Islam, which is contradictory because most of them many of them understand that the period of the caliphs was a period of oppression, and therefore when they say go back to the original text of the Quran, without understanding there's not an original text of the Quran, there's not an original text of the Hadiths, because these were all written during the periods of oppression, and therefore they reflect the periods of oppression. And therefore the interpretations become ones which push backwards. And then you get the reactionaries, the complete reactionaries on the other side, the David Landism people, who have no understanding of this religion, who say absurd things about it, and don't understand. I mean, David Landis' book, for instance, you wouldn't understand that Islam was a religion propagated by merchants, propagated by people who want to develop the forces of production and the means of livelihood and so forth in the first place. As I say, people talk about the Sharia. They don't understand the Sharia essentially was a code which merchants in the cities used to control their relationship with each other. The cities is a civil code of civil law. In most of the Arabic societies, in most of the Islamic societies, serious criminal law was administered by the caliphs, not according to the Sharia, because the caliphs were not prepared to devolve responsibility for criminal matters to the clerics. The clerics devolved civil law, that divorce, relationship with people, and so on and so forth. You've got all these myths, and one of the duties, the most important thing today, facing the wave of Islamophobia, is to unpick the myths and to understand there have always been two trends in Islam. There have been trends of people fighting for a better society, believing if you go back to the original period of the Prophet, you see a way of fighting for a better society. And there's a trend who want to go back and want to stop society as it is at present, changing, getting rid of oppression in any way whatsoever.